And why did you want to run an ad on our podcast?
We see it as it's a different avenue. We didn't want to do the same thing. We didn't want to run an ad with a really annoying limerick or something. Yeah, we wanted to do something that firstly supported something in WA and also something that created content. As I said, I've listened to podcasts, hundreds of podcasts in cars, on journeys, planes, around the field, rock chipping, mapping, whatever it is. And podcasts are a great way to make that day just go a little bit quicker. We want to be a part of that. Hopefully they remember us because of whatever episode you've produced. In general, we provide people, geos, field staff. We do some off-siders as well. We're providing vehicles and we still upgrade those as well for exploration. So that, we fit them with long-range tanks so the guys aren't having to worry about how much fuel they've got. We want to be there and provide everything. We just want to make their lives easy.
You want to be the Bunnings of exploration and so on.
Yeah, anytime, anywhere, Hi, I'm Seamus Murphy. I'm General Manager of Anytime Exploration Services. And you're listening to Exploration Radio.
I'm your host Ahmad, and this is Exploration Radio. You are listening to episode 67, which is part 2 of our discussion with Scott Briscoe on defining discovery. If you missed part 1, check out episode 66. Let's explore. So Scott, previously when we were talking about the discussion that we were having was really around this talk that you gave around, what is discovery? You gave this talk in Denver as part of the Denver Mineral Symposium. I can't quite remember exactly what the title was.
Yeah, I actually have to look up the title because I'm really terrible with remembering titles. But the thing that I do remember is the people that put it on was the Denver Regional, let me see here. It's called the Denver Mineral Exploration Summit. And the reason I remember who put it on is their acronym is DREGS. And so it's the Denver Regional Exploration Geology Society. So it's like the perfect name for a geology society,
Yeah, that's right. So we started this, I guess, part 1 of our kind of discussion around this talk that you gave, which is titled, What is Discovery? And what you really kind of dug into in that talk, or I guess what the 2 points that I got out of it were there were 2 things that kind of stood out to me. One is that the definition of discovery, as in the semantics or the lexicon of that definition, aren't very well understood. You had this great slide where I think you'd asked a number of people and they all had very different definitions of discovery or what they would qualify as discovery. By extension, if you have so many different definitions of that word, then effectively that word has no definition really. It's really the power of the person really to decide what they want to call discovery and what they don't want to call discovery.
Oh yeah, no, I was going to say that's a big risk too when you think about it, right? Because if everybody is pursuing discovery, well, we could be pursuing different things because we're defining it different, right? So it's like what a discovery, and that makes sense to an extent, like where like what Newmont considers a discovery is different than like what a $15 million market cap junior would just consider it.
So that was one of the things that, we've created this kind of gap that we've created because, like person A uses discovery in one way, they're talking about apples, this other person's talking about oranges, and this third person could be talking about something completely different. In essence, we don't have a common language that when we talk about discovery. And the second thing I think for me that I got out of your talk was that it's actually hard to know when you've discovered something as well. So the definition of it is hard, but also a lot of things at the early stage don't look like discovery. They don't look like the obvious thing that we think of. It's X million ounces of gold, or it's X million tons of copper and nickel, whatever. And it's really hard to know that even early on kind of world-class systems. So that aspect of discovery is much easily defined in hindsight when people stand and go, well, clearly it's a 5 million ounce deposit, so it was a great discovery. And it's like, okay, but what does it look like from days 1 to 99?
Yeah, I was going to say it was really interesting because there was a copper explorer in the audience, and one of the questions they asked, they ended up like turning it to like be kind of gold centric, but they did mention, well, this would look totally different if it was a world class copper discovery, right? So if you found some brand new copper porphyry, and at the same time, I kind of challenge that because we might know there's lots of copper in the system, but if you don't have that like kind of high grade core that seems to be really necessary to kick the economics up, do we even know if we have a world class copper porphyry discovery early on, right? And it's not my exploration search space, so I'm not versed enough to talk about it. But from what I've looked at, it's it's really easy to define things after the fact, but it's really challenging to recognize them when they're in front of you, and especially with all the day-to-day challenges that when you're exploring, right? So it's like you've still got the drill turning, right? So it's like maybe you've drilled 10 holes on this project and you've moved the rig off to this next project, and you have a 60-day turnaround. Well, what does that do to your discovery process, right? Because you think about, oh, well, 60 days from now, I have to re-engage my brain in the initial drill program, what we were thinking, what we were looking at. And obviously, if you get some like ripping good intercepts, it's going to be, like a different thing. Often that's not the case, right? Where you get, I forgot how many deposits it were that wouldn't have been discovered in their first 30 holes or even 50 holes. And there's some that they say wasn't for 90 holes, right? So you're like, well, what if there's a 60-day lead time between when you get those results back? It even makes it harder to figure out what you have.
Yeah, and I guess that was the point that I kind of focused on, is that even in world-class deposits, I think, like your example was great, that by, I think it was like 20 drill holes or like 30 drill holes, it still was pretty sketchy on whether you've actually got a multi-million ounce system or not. So there were these two kind of ideas I guess I want to kind of explore in this talk that we're going to have. One is that from as a community point of view, we don't have a great definition of what discovery is. So are we all actually looking for the same thing? And you kind of mentioned this, like, are we all actually after the same thing, or are we not? And then the second part of it is that when we are actually getting closer to something, we don't really know whether that thing is actually valuable or a discovery in the true kind of lexicon that we would use it in.
Yeah. And you think about that, because that's the time period when you're trying to raise more dollars, when you're trying to convince the exploration manager or like whoever in your chain of command that makes that decision to fund it again, right? And it's when it's not clear. And so actually I wanted to read a quote on so I really like Nick Tate's stuff, and so he commented on one of the posts, and he said, interesting perspectives. It demonstrates that the popular graphs of declining discovery rates are effectively impossible to assess because there's no standard definition of discovery. Graphs of new mines brought into production might be more robust, but of course they have a huge time lag compared to the exploration activity that generated them. So we talk about this all the time at every conference I go to. Oh, look at the discovery, rate graph. And it's like, well, if we can't even define it, how do we even put the things on the graph, right? It's like, oh, only when it gets to 1 million ounces or 5 million ounces. Well, what about like companies like Newmont and Barrick and other big companies have been notorious for not talking about new discoveries they've made until they're really advanced down the exploration pipeline. So you look at, there could be discoveries that have been made in the last even 5 years that still aren't even being discussed because they don't have, maybe they're still waiting for permits, right? Maybe they have an economic, or let's say a geologically interesting drill result, but they're still waiting for all the things that they would need to declare it. So how do we even make a graph?
This is, I guess, one of the root things that I guess I want to talk about is that it's exactly what you said, that if we can't define what discovery is, then maybe that graph is user driven. So, so the user has defined what they think are discoveries, and then they've been put on there. Even flip this argument around and say, well, if we don't know what a discovery is, then does the word discovery actually carry any amount of value that we think it does? Because it's either being overused or underused at some point. So so are we bastardizing the term because we're using it too much and it's losing its kind of value along the way?
It's really interesting because I think Newmont, for example, is very particular about this, and I won't go into what they call like in-house like that because I don't want to give away our company secrets. They'll execute me in the middle of the podcast. It'll be bad, but I think like they've become cognizant of that. If they sell up through the chain of command in the company that we've made a new discovery and then it falls on its face, they've recognized that you lose ultimately credibility. And I wouldn't say they're even too guarded about it. It's like, because you can do that too, where you can say, oh, nothing's a discovery, and then don't ever get excited.
And then you shoot yourself in the foot, right? Because it's like, did you make any discovery? No, because they're like they're so rare, we haven't found anything. And eventually people go, well, this discovery group doesn't seem to make any discoveries, so like let's get rid of them.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like the budgets that Newmont and Barrick and all these other majors put into the ground for looking for new discoveries, as well as for growing their resource and reserve bases. It's a huge amount of money. We're pretty careful in-house on what we call that. And so I think like our team's pretty well aligned. Like when we've hit something new, we communicate it well within the group, and then kind of like discuss a lot on what needs to be done before it makes it to the next stage. We can maybe be a little too conservative at times, but you compare it to the flip side. Like I was reading some juniors press releases, and it's like, mapping is a discovery where you found a new auriferous quartz vein, and it's like, but that doesn't do any justice either, because it goes back to the same issues, credibility, right? So if you're trying to draw new investors, and I think one of your guests maybe a year ago talked about the investors that we're trying to draw back into gold, they're done. They don't want to come back into gold, right? They got so badly burned that they just threw their hands in the air and they walked away from the space, right? And so then you're like trying to draw new investors in, and a lot of those are like mom and pop investors now. Like, I think the stock market's greatly changed in the last couple of years. Again, I'm not an economist, but when I look at like the meme stocks and things like that, where people on Reddit are driving up stock prices greatly based on discussions, you could be a cynic and say that they're trying to do it like a pump and dump and all that. But I think a lot of those people are genuinely like, no, this needs to change. We need to look at this differently. So if we're trying to attract investors like that, and they take all these press releases at face value, they come into the industry, they start investing, and then they get burned. I always toy around with following different junior stocks, and I hardly ever invest in any actual mining companies, which is kind of a sad thing in itself. And I look at like, I'm really glad I haven't, because my portfolio would be a massive loss. And I look at, I'm not an uneducated investor in terms of knowing the technical side and knowing what management teams need to do. And so if I would be getting burned if I had invested real money, imagine what the mom and pop investors, and imagine what they'd be saying on Reddit if they're like, they said they had a new discovery, and it turns out it's this meaningless thing that nobody even agrees on. It's a real change we need to make in the way we talk about these things.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think so. I'm going to throw out a term here, like, I actually think that, like in marketing, there's this term called like puffery, or puffery of marketing. And it's essentially a thing like a puffery marketing is like a statement that has no legal meaning and it's always open to interpretation. So for example, like, if I was making t-shirts, I could, in my ad, claim that it's the world's most comfortable t-shirt. And it's like, well, how do you actually prove that, right? I can't prove it. It's never provable. Or like, car ads often have like industry leading in its class or something like that. And it's like, what does that mean? Like, like what's the definition of that? Oh, I don't know. Like, can't, like, it's nothing you can ever sue me for, but I can say it and it sounds great. And I think actually the kind of a lot of the industry, particularly like the junior side, but I think like, most mineral exploration industry is kind of falling in the same trap where the term discovery is becoming like puffery marketing, where anytime anyone finds something, they go, it's discovery, because it's the only way investors will look at it. Yeah, and there's no other way to kind of attract people's attention. So you have to say it's like one intersection, one anomaly, one soul sample that goes, and it's like it's discovery, because it's the only thing that cuts through the noise anymore with investors.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I look back in like early in my career when I was doing a bunch of rock chip sampling and mapping and things, and at the time, it was all the things that led up to like a discovery that we had made on that project, but I can't even imagine going to market with those, like, oh yeah, we got quarter ounce gold. So, like, I just can't even imagine it, because at the time, like, I think you would have been, I hate to say it, like laughed off the investment platforms, but like people wouldn't have taken it seriously. And that was not that long ago, right? 15, 18 years ago or whatever. And I look at, as we hit this almost like desert of new discoveries, which however we want to define them, I think like everybody can agree that that's pretty much going on across the board, whatever commodity you're talking about. When was the last nickel discovery, and when was the last, like say uranium discovery, because that like probably hasn't been one since Fukushima, right? And so right. You look at all these things, it's like as that's waning, yeah, as you said, people are trying to get interest in it. And it's almost like the boy who cried wolf type situation, right? Where people aren't looking at the impact to the industry, they're looking at the impact of their individual stock, and they're going, I desperately need to raise money right now. Like maybe they've got a great project, right? I've got a great project and I have no way to separate, like the wheat from the chaff, and to get investors to recognize this is a great project. And so what do I say to get people on board? And I think I don't know, I go back to, I'll probably, again, get myself into trouble with some of this stuff, but I go back to things like the 43101 and all these instruments. A lot of those were designed to prevent another Bre-X, right? And you go back to well, will they actually prevent another Bre-X? Because, they say, oh yeah, the independent person going to visit the site will catch those things. And I go, yeah, maybe, would you really stop that? But at the same time, what it has stopped is, I feel kind of like the basics of exploration success, right? Because people are so focused on how to get this thing translated into a 43101 and the cost associated with it and the time associated. And I think it's fundamentally changed the industry, but not necessarily all good ways. I mean, there are many good things about it. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing to do, but it almost goes back to, maybe they need to have a term that defines discovery.
I think that's kind of the issue. If you're an investor and what you're told is that if you're investing in the junior market, what you really got to be investing in is a company that's making a discovery, right? And then as an investor who maybe doesn't have the background knowledge to actually discern, good projects, bad projects, good result, bad exploration results, you're just being bombarded by all these companies saying discovery, I found a discovery, I've got a discovery, I've got a discovery. And so as an investor, your attention is being diluted by all of these companies saying discovery. And I think so this goes back to kind of your problem of the charts. And I think one of the problems with it is that people go, oh, juniors make more discoveries. And it's well, yeah, because everyone in the junior space calls everything a discovery. So, so there's just the number of them is just higher. And so the junior market is getting more aggressive about calling everything a discovery. And the major market is getting more conservative about calling something a discovery because they really needed to be a lot bigger for it to be meaningful to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because and not to go too much into the politics of it and things like that, but leading up to the Nevada Gold Mines transaction, the way that Newmont reported their resource and reserves and kind of mineral inventory was very different than what Barrick did. And so essentially when people weighed those two companies, and these are the two biggest gold mining companies on the planet, right? But when people weighed those two companies, they didn't have a fair shake of how their projects actually weighed up against each other. And that's they're again, they're following all the rules. They're doing all the resource reporting by the jurisdictions they're in. Newmont was a U.S. traded thing, so it's much more stringent on you can't even talk about inferred resource. And well, now you can with the new changes to the SEC. But you're looking at those are the two biggest gold companies, and I think the investors are confused about what they actually had. And it's how do you justify this for the juniors, right? And then you get into things like how remote is the project, right? A discovery in Nevada is significantly different than a discovery in the interior of Alaska or in the Yukon or even you think about in the middle of Australia, right, where you get into the Nullarbor Plain, and it's that presents a whole level of challenges that you wouldn't have if you're near a city, right? The fly in fly out market's different. The bringing equipment in is everything has changed, right? And so it's really hard for people to weigh what is a discovery and what does it mean? Because I think ultimately that's what we really care about is what does it mean? If you're an investor and you're trying to get in at that ground floor, before the company takes off and the stock triples or goes up even 10 times or 30 times, that's when you make your real money. And that's what people are trying to time, right? They're trying to jump in before it's gone on to the stock forums and everybody's talking about it. Because I remember early on in my career, I invested in a little junior, and I tried to invest in it when they basically were almost on the verge of bankruptcy. And it was so funny. I tried to invest $400, and I got a message back saying this would unduly influence the price on the stock market. You need to do a smaller transaction. And I was like, it's $400. And if I had invested at that level, I would have made $45,000 on my 400. because of where it ended up going to. As it was, I still made a fair bit of money, but it was like nobody ever times that. And of course, I didn't have any real money because it was like early in my career and like, you know, I had kids and stuff like that. But it's like everybody wants to jump in at that and make, you know, 10,000 fold or 1,000 fold or even 100 or 10 fold like return on their investment, right? And that's the thing that they're trying to suss out when they read these press releases and they go, "Ooh, you know, what's this company got?" And it's just it's almost like an injustice. And I hate to call for like more regulations and things like that in the way we report these things, but it's, yeah, we're not doing anything to protect the investors. And likewise, you know, I forgot how many companies there are on the TSX Venture Exchange and you know, on the Australian exchanges. There was something like 4,000 juniors, and I would hazard a guess that 500 of them have a real project, maybe. And so you're looking at, if you're an investor, there's 3,500 companies that you could invest in and get burned on. And there's maybe 500 that have a real project.
That's kind of the challenge is that, and don't get me wrong, I totally understand why junior companies behave that way. Yeah, like if I'm a junior company, what's the, like at the end of the day, until I get to having a meaningful project or a meaningful discovery or meaningful event, you know, like discovery hole or anything like that, all I'm trying to do is kind of stay afloat. So I'm going to do whatever I can to stay front of mind of investors as long as I can. And so, yeah, so if that means that I have to, yeah, like for all intents and purposes, cry wolf so investors look at me and then put money in so I can then go raise money and do something with my project, yeah, like why wouldn't I do it? Because yeah, like, hey, like I gotta survive. Like, you know, like I gotta get to the finish line somehow, and I'm not gonna get there by running out of money and then, you know, like completely blowing up the company and going bankrupt. So I totally understand why junior companies fall into that trap. So it's not to say that they're doing something bad or anything like that. I think
No,
they're just fighting for their survival in a lot of ways.
I think that's exactly it. Like I look at like companies I've worked for in the past and like friends that I have, you know, because like you get to know people in the industry and they work for every company on earth. Basically, there's someone that you know this, you know, that works with them, right? And so like I know a lot of good management teams, good geologists with good projects struggling to raise money, especially in this environment, right? And you know, like you see, I don't know, I've seen a number of press releases where it's like, oh, we're going to raise 3 or 5 million bucks, and then they raise 300,000 or 400,000. So it's like, oh, you're barely going to stay in business, and you might have to let your entire geology staff go if you can't raise more money. And so it's like, yeah, they definitely need something to be able to differentiate themselves. And it's like, and you know, the average investor has no idea who the management teams are, right? Like that, it's very difficult to like kind of investigate, you know, like, oh, who's this chief geologist this project, and oh, okay, they're really good and they've got a good track record, you know, because they'll all say that on their about me pages, right? But it's like trying to actually figure out who's good and who's not, and who's made discoveries and who's been associated but claimed that they made the discovery, right? And it's, yeah, that stuff's impossible. And so it's, yeah, and going back to like that talk, it's even if you make a discovery, even if you go and you have some great drill results come in, which is ultimately, like I always call it, the truth machine, right? So like that's, you know, that's the machine that doesn't lie to you. You know, obviously you can like drill like down veins and things like that, but like through time, you know, that's the only way that we understand what's going on. And you look at like how hard is it even to define at that stage, right? You know, like we're in that talk, I ran all these kind of random polls of collars, which is like, this is after it's been drilled, and it's like a number of the, you know, 10-20 hole programs would have failed to find that world-class system. And so it's like, if you go back to like drill pattern really matters, the orientation of your drilling really matters, the data you collect really matters. And if you're trying to like differentiate yourself, and you say you put in that drill program, like that first 11 holes, and I think one of them had over 100 gram meters. You put that out to market. I don't even know if the market would move right now on that. I don't even know if you could raise money on that.
Right.
So, and it's like, and that's now a world-class system, but you know, you don't know until you do that second phase program.
That's right. And I think so so we talk about like the junior space where it's creating this problem where, you know, because it's hard for them to define what discovery is, each junior company is kind of applying its own definition to that word, and they're then using that to attract investors. But I think in the major space, I think it's even, you know, it's a similar problem in that if you can't define what discovery is, and you can't identify it early enough, then like how do you actually progress projects through by knowing whether they're going to become something or not? A company like Newmont could have 100 gram per meter intersection, but what does it mean to them, right? Because a system that they would mine needs to have like X number of them, or like, and that X is definitely greater than one, right? So it's like, so, and so I think like, so major companies sometimes, I mean, the ones that I worked in, like, we would have to come up with some other mechanism of kind of identifying whether this project meets some threshold that we want. And usually, they're called many different things, but, the companies I worked in, they were always called MRT, the minimum resource threshold. And it's like, okay, well, so let's take your example, right? So if a large company defines a discovery with an MRT, a minimum resource threshold, well, how do I know whether it meets it before any holes are drilled, or after 10 holes are drilled, or after 20 holes are drilled, or after 30 holes are drilled? And it becomes this problem where someone goes, well, does this meet our MRT? And you're like, well, mate, we've drilled 2 holes into it. I got no idea. Right. And they're like, well, we need to know that as quickly as possible before we progress. And it's like, well, now we because we can't answer the question of what is a genuine discovery, we're now creating another question that we want people to answer, which is, well, how big is the resource? You're like, well, I don't even know if it's a discovery or not.
And it's a really, I think that's like the key thing when I talk to like the site teams and things like that. Unnamed big companies, like I've seen have these various things of like risking and reducing risk on resource deliveries, right? And sometimes it becomes almost comical where you're like, okay, so we think we have potential for like a 1,000,000-ounce system or whatever, and by the time you've like risked it down, it's like, oh, it's 10,000 ounces, it's not worth drilling. And it's like, what? That's not how you do exploration. It's just like it's easy to kill off all your projects early on. And so like kind of the thing that I'm encouraging some of our teams to do now, and it's a bit of a challenge sometimes, like because you think about all of our geos have worked for big companies for the most part. Some of them have come in from the little companies and things like that. And Newmont and Barrick and all these other big companies are great at like resource reserve conversion. Some of them are great at exploration too. But some of them, like, it's like a new way of thinking, right? If you've been a mine geo all your career and now you're having to step out into brownfields exploration, what does success look like? And so I always kind of go back to that idea of like this exercise I did for that talk. Take your own company data set and reduce it down to what would it look like if I have, for example, like in Timmins, we have Hoyle Pond mines. So what would it look like with the first 10 holes that got drilled into Hoyle Pond? What would it look like with the first 30 or 50? What if I drilled it differently? What if what if my exploration strategy is drilling all shallow holes? And I only looked through the shallow hole database, would I find it? What if it's only drilling all deep holes? What if it's a mix? And so I think ultimately for us to recognize what new discoveries look like, we have to actually have the context of what a discovery looks like on the site we're exploring at, right? And so if you're in the Carlin Trend and you're discovering, it's going to be a very different thing than if you're in, I don't know, Batu Hijau, or if you're in, the Tanami or something like that. And so I go back to the site teams ultimately who are doing exploration. They need to look at what does the footprint of a system look like early on, right? And can you recognize it with just gold? Like if we're, because I know in the past, like everybody was just doing gold assays, right? So it's
That's
like,
right. Yep.
So are you?
Which is an important point as well, right? Like, because if all you're using is gold, and then you're essentially saying you're gonna have to find the mineralization before you find anything else. So what does a near miss look like? Like what if you're just on the edges of a system, and all of those kind of questions come into play as well.
Yeah, and then what orientation do you drill at, right? You look at like our project at Musselwhite is a real shallow plunging kind of ore shoot, right? And it's a really cool looking system. But it's like, if you drill a vertical hole, what are the odds you're going to hit it versus if you drill an angle hole? And so it's really key for like geos to recognize what are they actually looking for? What does success look like from a known system? And how much can you tell from one drill hole or 10 drill holes, right? And so it's kind of, again, it almost sounds like a bit like a cop out where it's just like, oh, well, every discovery should be defined by the discoveries near it. It's like, okay, that does not apply in the greenfields because you don't have any discoveries near it. So now you have to think a totally different way, right? And so it's It's actually one of my favorite conundrums when I go and talk to site teams is how do we improve our exploration success? How do we improve how we can recognize if we've had success? And then like one of the things that's always entertaining to me as well is look at some of these big camps like Timmins, or like obviously we don't own Val-d'Or, but like Val-d'Or is another giant one in Canada, and then you can look at any across the world, and you go to, well, what's alteration look? Is like St. Ives is a good example, or if I remember right, almost every single mine had a different alteration signature, right? So it's like, one of them, there's a great paper on fluid mixing. And it's like, okay, we had clinozoisite in these veins, and we had epidote in these veins, and where the two mix, they destabilized the gold fluids and precipitated out a bunch of gold. That I think only worked at that one deposit. So it's like, so if you're using that as your criteria for like, oh, we need to see epidote clinozoisite in different veins, well, you wouldn't find the other ones, right? And so it's like every system has so many, and I always talk about it as like, like if you essentially source your fluids from whatever, like I actually don't have a dog in the fight of what the fluid source is, whether it's, from intrusives or whether it's orogenic fluids or whatever. Like, cause I go at this point, it's so academic. It doesn't actually affect us. It does on the crustal scale when we're looking to what camps we want to get into. So if you're doing greenfields exploration, that stuff matters. But once you're like in a camp, I go, okay, that fluid has come up from whatever source, and it has gone, like some fluids went along this pathway, and then some fluids kind of went along this shallower structure. And now they've interacted with different wall rock. And so like this fluid now has a totally different composition than that fluid. And by the time they get to their final destination of the trap, or the what was going to become the ore host, they are totally different fluids. So if they hit the same rock, they're going to look like totally different alterations. And so I go like, don't limit yourself to saying, I need to find potassic alteration or whatever. It's like, maybe that deposit has that, but maybe this one has hemalbite, and maybe this one has, like the epidote, clinozoisite. And so it's so difficult to, I kind of impress that upon people. It's just like, be open-minded, right? It goes back to like that whole idea of like, the ore host is going to be whatever's better than its neighbors, and it's going to be whatever's best for the ore fluid, right? So like I worked at one deposit where and I might have talked about this already, but like one of the intrusive rocks was basically in chemical equilibrium with the ore fluid, and so it had almost zero visible alteration. But then the rocks next to it would be like, you'd have this nice rheological contrast, and you'd build like a nice ore system right next to it. But if you had happened to just drill into that one rock, you would have been like, it's deader than a doornail, walk away.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think this is, what you're kind of identifying is like the complexity in certain geological systems. Yeah, like gold deposits can be found in basically any host rock. So you can't condense it into a framework that you can just kind of cookie cutter from one area to another. And I think sometimes, and I understand why the certain management and certain companies want that kind of cookie cutter approach to go, well, we have 50 projects on the go. Which one of these looks like a discovery like this? Like, can I look it through this lens, and does it look exactly the same, or does it not look exactly the same? And I think that creates a kind of a problem for us practitioners, because it's hard for us to identify what something looks like until we get closer to the end. It's really hard for us to tell at the start and in the middle. And I can kind of see like why that language is a problem even in big companies, because the corporate guys want something that can be condensed into a meaningful kind of, like, I guess, a soundbite that they can take and they can communicate. But on the other hand, you're talking about something that has this enormous level of complexity, which they want to condense down to like a one-line item or something like that. And I just think like, it's like, like one person speaking English and the other person speaking Klingon, and like, it's not going to kind of like marry easily in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing you think about. Most big companies don't have geologists at the top. Obviously, Barrick is an exception. But most of them, they're people that have worked their way up the ranks through other practices in mining, right? So whether they're mining engineers or accountants or even like lawyers, right? Like, and we always talk about, like the lawyers running companies and things. I think Roy Woodall has some great quotes on that. But whatever that situation is, we have no control on it. That's up to the board of directors, the investors, right? And so ultimately, we have to find a way to communicate with those people, right? And so you're communicating incredibly difficult concepts and ideas. And if you can't define what success looks like, why are they going to buy it, right? It's like, why are they going to fund it? And so it goes back to it's kind of like the how to win friends and influence people, right? It's like kind of like one of the key things in there is if you're selling something, and we're selling ideas, right? If you're selling something, you have to find out what the buyers actually wanting, right? What is their need? Because if your product isn't filling that need, and you don't want to be like the used car salesman too, where you're just giving them a bunch of BS that's not true. But if you're like selling them something that they don't care about, they're not gonna say yes to it, no matter what you do, right? And so it's like, okay, what do they care about? And then how do I simplify this, right? And I'm not sure if I could tell the story, but I will. So our senior VP of exploration was talking to one of our high corporate guys and was explaining drilling at this one project. And he had a muffin, and he's like, talking to him at breakfast. And he's like, all right, so if we're drilling, we've got toothpicks, and we're trying to stab them into this muffin to find the chocolate chips. And so, we're stabbing in here, and he's like, and how many toothpicks do I have to stab into this muffin before we find the chocolate chips? And then he breaks open the muffin. And he's like, oh, it turns out it's like a raisin muffin. And so if we were looking for chocolate chips, well, we actually found raisins. Is that success or failure? Right. And he's like, so some of the time we have to figure out ways to describe the systems and to describe an analogy in a way that the people will understand. Right. And I look at I think that actually worked really well, because in this case, both raisins and chocolate chips are ore, but they're different alteration patterns. They're different things. And so if you use the criteria, I'm going to find a chocolate chip, well, you didn't find anything, because that's a raisin muffin, right? And yet we found something, because that raisin muffin is it's got the prize there, right? And I go back to such a simple analogy, but it's like, has anybody explained that to the corporate folks that don't dig into detailed geology, that don't have a geology degree and haven't sat on an exploration rig? Because it's like, if we expect them to be like us and to understand geology, that's not what they're there for. That's not why they were put into that job, right? The board of directors presumably had a reason to choose this person or that person. And so we need to translate it in a way that they can understand and find useful, right?
And I think this is a great example of how I think sometimes, groups kind of stumble over their own feet in a lot of ways, because they go, it's what's the KPI of the exploration team? It's like, oh, well, to make discoveries. And it's like, okay, well, if we can't define discovery, how do we actually know whether we've been successful or not? And it's like, okay, well, what's our KPI? It's to make discoveries. And it's all right, great, but what is a discovery? What do we qualify it as? When do we know we have one? When do we know that we definitely have one? And all these things. So I think in the world of kind of condensing everything down to a metric, we've kind of lost sight of the fact that actually the metric that we're using is incredibly hard to define, and it's incredibly hard to identify. So maybe that's not the best metric. Maybe a more appropriate metric would be, it's what does success look like for an exploration group? Well, success looks like, replacement of reserves or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, that's something tangible that we can kind of get to. It doesn't mean that we have to sit around and define, is this a discovery? Is this going to offset this, this development project that we have, and all of those kind of things. And I think that, that's, I think, one of the kind of the challenge that we're kind of finding now is when people go, well, exploration isn't returning any value. And my question a lot of the times is, well, how do you define value first? Then let's figure out whether we're actually meeting that metric or not. Because if you're telling me that, if exploration's job is to make discoveries, well, I'm not really sure what that discovery kind of looks like. I mean, in your example, your example is a great one, right? It would be interesting to know the dollar figure that actually had to be spent to take it from hole number 1 to take it to hole number whatever n that allowed you to get to the minimum resource threshold, right? The 2.5 million ounces or something like that. Like, what was that dollar value? Because if that dollar value, if you're not getting that dollar value in year number one, then it's kind of hard or completely useless to try to see whether you're going to actually get to kind of your whatever minimum threshold that will qualify it as a discovery.
There's a lot of key things that we need to be better at identifying and recognizing as an industry and as individual geologists too, right? So going back to when we first do a drill program, it's like, all right, what do you actually request for? What are you going to put in and say, oh, well, I'm afraid that they're not going to fund a 20-hole program, so I'll put in for 3 holes. And then you drill 3 holes and they're almost guaranteed to be dusters because that's the way it works, right? And well, then you walk away from that target because they're not going to invest a second, round. And so it's almost like, do you be bullish and you say, okay, we're going to commit 50% of our brownfields drill budget to this one target, and we're going to drill 25 holes or whatever. And then you go, okay, all your eggs are in one basket. What if that basket's not the one with eggs in it? And so it's really, it's a challenge, and I think this is the art form of exploration, right? It's managing expectations. It's also I think geos would be well versed in understanding more about like human psychology and things like that as well. Because I go back to that whole idea of like, okay, so if I put in 25 drill holes in this one area, is that an adequate test? Is it overboard? Is it underkill? Is 5 holes? Is 100 holes? Because there is a point where people will go, there's no way we're going to pay for you to grid drill the Tanami Desert or whatever, right? And so there is a limit there, and but then it goes back to like, you have to define success up front, right? Because if I say, okay, I'm going to put a drill program in 15 holes, and I don't tell anybody what my success metric is, and then we drill the 15 holes and we have like buku alteration, but we have no gold. And so, do we walk away? But if I had said in my thing, like, we're looking for an alteration footprint to understand if there's a system here that's sizable enough to host the amount of ounces we're looking for, and then I don't have any gold results, but I show the systems there, well, that's the success criteria. You have to get people to agree to it, right? So you have to say, okay, here's what I'm looking for. And so it goes back to like, I always go, I hate when people are doing like strat holes, because I think it just sounds kind of like, are we looking for gold systems or not? But I understand why we do it, right? Because we're looking to say, well, what's the stratigraphy look like? What's alteration look like? What's it look like away from the system? Because like some of these systems, like you look at like in Timmins, if you take a sample from the highway next to the Hollinger mine, that's probably going to be altered, right? Because there's like 25 million ounces next door, right? So I have to go how far away from the Hollinger mine before I find a dead sample, right? Is it 100 meters? Is it 10 kilometers? Like where is that, right? And so I kind of go back to that idea, like the strat holes. Well, sometimes that's really key. If my success metric is I need to understand what unaltered rock looks like, so I'm going to drill into a similar lithology away from the system. Obviously, that doesn't sound like I'm looking for gold, and which you never know, I might find it, right? But it's like I'm trying to understand my system so I can quantify what's going on close. But I have to sell that to management. I have to tell them what to expect from my drill program, because if they come back and everything's double aught squat, they're not going to be interested, and they're going to be like, oh, well, this is garbage program. But if you say, here's what the success criteria was, and we've met it, then this is why we want to do a second phase of drilling is, because we've now seen the alteration footprint, or we've seen the structural complexity we're looking for, or something as simple as the geological model didn't match what we saw in drilling. And so something is going on there that, like, I always joke around, like one of the best tools that Leapfrog has is, creates all the weird bubbles and stuff. If you let it drive itself, look at where it's not making sense, because there's usually something going on there, right? So it's like, maybe that's your success criteria, is to say, we have the structure projected to be doing this, and if it does something different, maybe, but you have to define it. You have to talk about it. And it's really challenging if you take people who have only done mine geology or only done green geology. It's really challenging to bring them into a brownfields environment and say, okay, now make success, because then the idea is like, oh, you're going to center punch an ore shoot. What are the odds, right? Like you look at Hoyle Pond as, 4.5 million ounces or whatever, and like probably 7 million ounce total system size, something like that. I can't remember. I should, but I can't. Anyways, what are the odds that you're going to center punch the main ore chute in that system with? Yeah, it's almost impossible. But at the same time, if you drill it and you're like, oh, we're seeing some really interesting things in the structures, like we're seeing some folding that's implying that there's a structure here that's caused this. And so now we're going to plan our second phase to take it and look for these things. But I almost feel like when I started in geology, people were more robust about this. And like you look at like WMC's, like I think really well known for documenting projects, right? So you can pick up a report from WMC and know exactly what they did and what their criteria were and what, and then at the end of the day, what they found, right? So it's like, here's what we were looking for. We didn't find it, blah, blah, blah. So it's really well documented. I've worked for some companies where like, they just drilled and it's like, no documentation, no record of what they were looking for or what success looked like or what failure
why or anything like that. And I think this is like in the first interview that we did, you kind of gave this analogy of fishing, like in fishing is similar to exploration. And I think this is, I guess, kind of the concept is that like we define discovery as a destination that, we get to a point where we find a deposit, it looks this big and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe discovery is a process, right? That we need to do certain things and the outcome of that could be the actual discovery of a deposit, or it could be knowledge that you gain that allows you to make a decision one way or the other, or whether you stay in this project or not. And I think like maybe we've kind of muddled that kind of understanding to go that actually discovery has to be a destination. It has to be that we get to the X marks the spot and we find the deposit and all of that stuff. Maybe it actually has to be that we gotta like remember that it's the process that it takes to get there, and the consequence of that process is a discovery of a new deposit and then success and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that's really key is sometimes when we're weighing work programs and what we've done, I often ask like, what are you guys looking to do? What programs have been done? What's been successful here? Like maybe on this project, rock chips are great. Maybe on that project, soil samples are great. Maybe there's 100 meters of cover and neither of those is going to be great. Or maybe, biogeochem, there's all these different things. And so I always go back to like, that process is never linear because it's going to be tailored to each project type and each kind of exploration concept. So that kind of means you have to come up with an exploration concept. And so you go, okay, well, have you done lithogeochem? Have you done 4 acid digest versus 2 acid digest, right? And it's like, if you're looking to understand, what kind of rock types you're having and what kind of alteration you're seeing, you should have a digest that's actually going to tell you that, right? And so I think like a big part of what I do in my job is when I go to sites, I ask a lot of questions. So I always feel bad because I'm now that corporate shill that's putting people on the spot, right? But it's like, I want to make sure that they're thinking about that as a process and not a linear one, but just as a process. Like, okay, so in order to develop up this target, what do we need to have more confidence in it? Like maybe it's not drilling. Maybe at this stage it's, like, look, we did air mag and we really like what we're seeing, but we need to do a little bit tighter spacing and, like whatever, right? And so it's always, I think what we need to do is say what needs to be done to improve our understanding, because what you don't really want to do, and there's been some debate on whether you'd actually be more successful with just grid drilling a project, right? But you don't want to be like see like just like, oh, we've given up on doing all geology, so now we're just doing a grid drill. Maybe there's value in that, right? Like the whole AirCore programs in Australia are like wildly successful in terms of, like there's no other way we would have ever gone out there except for this grid drilling project. So maybe there is value to it, but it's like, we need to define what do we need to know? What do we, in order to make our next decision point, whether that's drilling or whether that's just committing to doing a ground, like basically outcrop mapping. What do we need to know to do more, right? And it's kind of funny because I think like a lot of geos, I've worked with so many smart geos. Like I always like one of the things I love is I long ago realized I'm not the smartest person in the room, and so I love working with these people and getting their input on things. And so what I try to do is ask questions that make them think about it in a different way, because then I go, they have the skills and experience to see this. Whereas I've just walked onto this project and I don't even know what the basic rock types are, right? And so it's like, what matters here? What's important? What do you guys find is key for this? And I think like through that questioning and answering process, you can dig into so much, and you can learn so much about like, okay, so what would be successful here? All right, so you probably don't want to do soil geochem because you've got like fluvial, or sorry, you got like a lacustrine cover, or maybe there's like these real nice clays in your lake or whatever, right? And it's just like, but you have to understand that, right? So it's like maybe you're going and trying to understand your geomorphology. Maybe you're trying to understand, okay, so again, so back to like what I talked about earlier, so we don't drill geophysical targets. You kind of try to understand what the anomaly is telling you about the rock, right? Why is it more dense there? Is it a rock type change? Is it an alteration change? And it's like, yeah. And so I think that's the thing that I see is people, and I've worked for juniors where we didn't have any money to do anything. And so we had time, so we could do mapping, and we had money to drill. So it was like mapping, drilling, not even like, rock chip sampling, not even geochem, like you couldn't even imagine doing a soil survey, right? Let alone like an aeromag survey. And it's like, okay, so everybody has their own situation, right? And so this project, maybe they're drill ready and they can like hit the ground running, and they just set up rigs, and it's like, and you get a little rig preserve going. And maybe this other project isn't even ready to do a soil geochem survey because we don't even understand the geomorphology, right? And it's like, what would the samples even mean if you took a soil survey, right? And so, yeah, so it's all about trying to understand where we're at and then where we're going and what the next step is. And that next step is always the challenge, right? Because it's like, it's funny because it's where people hesitate the most. And again, I work with these great geos, so like I had this site visit a week or so ago, and it was just phenomenal. Like these geos were just so fired up and so excited. And so it's like, well, let's go out and look at some rocks in the field. And it's like, maybe just visiting an outcrop that's been mapped by some PhD student will actually trigger something in our understanding of the deposit that reading the map didn't. Because it always goes back to like, I'm not sure if I talked about this already, but like the Magic Eye puzzles from like the 90s, where like there was all these weird patterns. And like when you first saw it, you're like, someone made a book of random noise. Okay, great, and but until someone tells you how to see it, and so how to translate that into then your mind seeing this image in 3D, all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's dolphins jumping out of the water, and someone's like, you're crazy. That's how structural geology is to me. Like if you don't know what like S3 foliation looks like, and all you see is the dominant S2 foliation, until someone points out what S3 foliation is, you might not have ever mapped it, right? And so I always go back to like, obviously there's some great PhD candidates and students that are doing this work, so I'm not trying to belittle people, but you only know what you've been trained to know and what you picked up in your own experience, right? So you can have someone that comes out and has never mapped a stretching lineation before. So they've done this great PhD quality map, but there's no stretching lineations measured because they didn't know what they looked like, right? And so then you go out to visit an outcrop and you're like, oh, check it out. There's a stretching lineation, and it's, oh, hey, it's parallel to the ore chute. That's really interesting. Maybe we should measure these.
Yeah.
And so,
but also like it's, I think one of the things is like, either one is knowing that information, and a B is being able to connect that information as well. So a lot of people might like identify stuff, but they have absolutely no idea what value it has or how they could connect it to something else along the way as well. And then I think this. Yeah, so I completely agree. I think in a lot of like kind of the stuff you're saying, where the concept is that you really is the process of discovery essentially a progressive building of knowledge to a point where you can make a decision. Is that really how we would end up defining discovery? Like I'm not quite sure exactly what the best definition is, but to me, one of the things I always found challenging is really around what your talk kind of talked about, is that it's actually not very easy to identify. And yet a lot of my job, and I would assume a lot of your job right now, is to actually identify when are we at the moment of discovery, or are we like one day before, or are we 10 days after now, or are we 100 days before? Like where in that timeline do we sit? And I think one of the hardest things, I think, is actually to define that, is to go, well, where do we actually sit? But but then from a corporate point of view, like they really need to know: are we 10 days before, or are we 100 days before, or are we one day before, or whatever that thing is.
Yeah, you've got a plan, right? And it's like, that's, I think, the thing that always amazes me with big companies like Newmont is how many people are involved in planning for something to go into production, right? And so if you can't give them some of the basics on that, all the rest of that mechanism is bound up waiting for it, right?
I know.
And
I mean, they are
it's
like, those guys are chomping at the bit for you to take like a project and like have enough resources so they can then like, build it and get it into production and do all of those things. And I think this is like, like exactly what you said. Like, they are, I think, impatient, like they're like, I would like to say they're patiently waiting, but I think they're impatiently waiting for us to actually figure out what we have. And we struggle because we just don't have the language or the mechanism to actually communicate that. I think in a lot of ways. And I think maybe that creates that perception that often is right. Well, the exploration guys, they just drill holes and find nothing, and it's yeah, like most people think we're just screwing around, like just spending money. And I think it like a lot of like, I mean, I genuinely think, like I think it's a language problem. We're just not very good at communicating what our process looks like and how many kind of like tentacles and branches and things that it actually has. And so they just don't understand it.
And you think about it, like sometimes it just takes a conversation where you sit down with the planners and the metallurgists and the engineers, and you get like also essentially like the key people that would be needed to put a discovery into production. And you sit down and you go, okay, so we're like really early stage and we've got 5 holes in it. Looks like it's really interesting. What do we need to do to satisfy your various like criteria to make this go into production? And I look at like that invincible thing. I think that's what we did really well. Is we like the whole team got on, like all the metallurgists and all the mine engineers and the planners, environmental, everybody got together and we sat down and went, oh well, we need to collect really good geotech right up front so we can make like just like pit slope assumptions, right? And we need to do metallurgy right up front to see if this fits into the current milling scenarios or whatever. And so, and I think that's why that mine went into production 3 years after the first drill holes, right? So it's like it was like the fastest I've ever heard of a mine going into production, and it's like, but it was we realized it was on the verge of like this is incredibly important for the site, and we need to make it happen. And so I go back to like the same thing with my company, right? We need to have those conversations, and it's really easy to make a meeting that's on like WebEx or Zoom. That's like 40 people on the meeting. And it's like, and then nobody feels any responsibility for it, right? Because it's like, oh, well, and so it's much easier to be like, oh, you know what? I need to have a one-on-one meeting with the metallurgist. And we need to say, hey, what kind of met testing do you need us to do? So we're trying to do this next phase of drilling down dip, and we're just trying to figure out what our costs are going to be. And so it's like, how do we even do met testing? Oh, you can't do it on NQ. You need us to do it on HQ. Oh, that changes the assumptions entirely. Oh, you need to do it on PQ. Oh my gosh, And so, but you have that conversation, and then when you're ready to hand it off to the people to like make it a mine, because that's what it always feels like. It's like, all right, it's tied up, packaged up. Here you go, make it a mine now. And they go, there's no geotech. There's no metallurgy. Like nobody's permitted this area, like nobody's even talked to us that we would need to permit this area. So we haven't even had the conversations. And I'm not saying we do that. Like I think our company's pretty good at doing that, but I think everybody can improve at it. And it's like, I think it's as simple as like picking up a phone and be like, hey, do you have 5 minutes to talk about this? Because we're getting ready to do this program. And it's, because otherwise it's an economic, it's a geological curiosity that we've drilled, right? And it's like now it has no way of going into production.
It's the dreaded technical success, right? And it's like, like does it matter to the company? Who knows? We never talked to that part of the business, and you're like, yeah, great, fantastic. So,
yeah. And it's kind of like, oh, we're not interested in this ore zone because it's refractory or whatever, and then it turns out like the metallurgists are like, we're dying for refractory ores to put through this, or whatever, right? And it's like it's so easy to make assumptions based on our very limited understanding of geology as a science, not as mining as a science, right? And like I think that's like the real success is when you have those cross-functional teams who look at projects, and like like Newmont has all these groups to do studies, right? but it's made up of people that have that cross-functional disciplines, right? So it's like, oh, okay, well, we need to work on this next phase of drilling needs to collect this kind of geophysical data. It can't just be RQD. It actually has to be, like the whole suite, right? And I look at it, if you don't communicate where you're at in a discovery process, or obviously that makes a lot of effort because you have to try and understand where you're at too. But then they can't plan around that, right? So it's like they can't then say, "Oh, okay, well we'll dedicate these people." They'll say, "Oh no, like we're flat out on a project, and you just spring this on us. We have no way to go through and do the." And so it's like really key to have those conversations. And I think like my colleague Gustav is always like heavily involved in that, because it's like that's the last thing we want is to hand off a project and be told, oh, sorry, that doesn't fit into the milling scenarios, or oh, sorry, that like that there's nowhere to store the tails, and like great, you found a new discovery, like now there's nothing that's going to happen with it. So it's to the dustbins of history it goes, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I guess one of the questions I guess I always wanted to ask is what did you want out of giving this talk? I mean, is this did you want to crowdsource like an idea about what you wanted to define as discovery, or do you already have that kind of idea in your head, but you wanted to I guess stress test it in front of a bunch of people and then see whether similar people were having problems, or sorry, if people were having similar problems or people were having different problems, or are you the only one standing on this ledge complaining about what is a discovery and everyone else is like, man, we understand it. Like Scott's lost his marbles and he doesn't know what discovery is, but the rest of us have a pretty clear idea about what discovery is.
So I think it's actually a bit of all of those things. I honestly did worry that I would stand up there and give that talk and then be like, why is this even a talk? Like, what are you doing?
Like, I need to call Newmont to tell him to sack Scott because he doesn't know what a discovery is.
No, that's the way it goes, right? But and so it's a bit of, I guess the other thing I look at is I take the very long view on industry, right? And so on geologists that I work with or have worked with in the past, I hope to work with again in the future, right? And so I go, if we can put this question out to the industry as a whole, maybe it'll help attract geologists who are interested in similar questions to come to Newmont and say, oh, well, I never considered them before. So there's always like will people get interested in coming to work for us that might have not otherwise? And then also like, I hate to say, can we improve the industry as a whole? Because that sounds really egotistical. I don't think anything I can do is going to fix the industry, right? But I go, maybe the questions I ask, maybe someone will come with an answer that I couldn't, right? And if we can discuss those things, maybe that'll improve the industry. Maybe that will give a way to say, oh, you know what? Like I always talk about geological mapping, and because I just hope that one day we'll find like a universal mapping solution that works like for BHP and works for Newmont and works for Barrick, and obviously it has modules that are specific to those companies.
That's an even bigger matzo ball than what is discovery. Like that's never gonna happen.
Yeah, that's crazy talk. Like discovery is easier to figure out than that.
We'll figure out discovery far earlier than ever figuring that out.
Yeah. But so I guess that's part of it is like, can we as an industry do better? Can me asking a question? Because like what I really loved was after the talk, I was actually like trying to head out because I had like to be home for dinner, right? And I ended up having like 2.5, 3 hours of discussions with people who were just interested in it. And we're like, oh, well, what about this? And oh, I wanted to talk to you about this. And so then it gives me new ideas. So that's always like, I think like the personal interest side, right? For me personally, as I learn more about our field and about discovery and about like how to make exploration more successful because of the conversations with people. But then it also like hopefully improves individuals that we talk to where they go, oh, I never thought about that. And, like I had like a couple juniors come up and be like, that's really interesting. I wish our investors would think about stuff like that. And it's like, maybe you should talk to them about things like that. Maybe you should talk to them about what a discovery is. Maybe we should be more open in terms of making this actually almost like a regular topic that shows up at conferences, right? Where it's just like, because people will always talk about, I feel that there's like two kinds of talks at those things. There's maybe three. There's like the academics who talk about the things that they were working on in their PhD or whatever. And then there's the companies who are pitching their project and their company. And then you have like the people who are like genuinely interested in the industry as a whole, and they're talking about like, hey, I was working on this thing and it looks like it'd be really useful for the industry. And so maybe this talk will spur someone to do a better talk at a future, like a conference or something like that. And maybe it'll make it so that it gels more in our own minds of, well, okay, maybe this is what a discovery is, and maybe this is a really good definition for it. And like even the comments I got on my LinkedIn post, I was like, this is like really insightful stuff. And it's like, I hadn't actually thought about this point. And so, yeah, so I guess there's a bit of self-interest and then a bit of what can it do for the greater industry and what can it do for individuals. So
I mean, I think like I guess I can give kind of my perspective. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to throw you under the bus to get you to do this talk was like essentially for the same reason that like I thought this was a problem that was somewhat maybe felt somewhat embarrassing for me, because at times like you were in these exploration groups and your job was to actually find something and kind of add to the inventory of the company that I was involved in, but I just never really understood what what would we look like, what exactly were we looking for, at what stage were we at on that kind of search, and exactly how did it all kind of fit. And I think these are probably questions like as you get kind of like higher up the organizational structure, where you have to deal with kind of decision makers, whether that's in a junior company you're dealing with investors, or in a major company where you're dealing with kind of the executives. I think it's quite important to kind of talk about, like the fuzziness around the process or the methodology of trying to get there. That what I hope is the last thing we should do is to tell people that it's a simple thing and that we have it under control, because I think the reality is that it's not simple, and there's a lot of complexity that we have to gather knowledge on to try to unwind and kind of get to that level. And I think intuitively people understand that from the mining side, because they go, oh, we see the metallurgy and we see this, we know this is complicated stuff. But like maybe we don't quite explain that on the exploration side or the discovery side, because people think exploration is just drilling holes into the ground and that's it. And if you drill enough holes in the ground, you're gonna get something, and then you'll find out how big or how small it is, or how valuable it is, or whatever it is. Maybe that's actually maybe not like the drilling part is the part we understand, but the rest of it, like we have a lot of fuzzy kind of logic around a lot of this stuff.
And I think that's like one of the key things that I guess I've learned is we need to be better at communicating the uncertainty, not just the definable uncertainties, but it's like we don't know what we don't know, it's like, and it's like the things like just geometry changes are really, really difficult to figure out. Right. And I think like a previous employer I worked for years back, they I think had done this kind of poorly, where the team of decision makers essentially came up with the idea that, oh, discovery is linear. If we spend X amount of dollars, it finds X amount of mines. So if we want to find 3 mines, we'll triple the funding and then we'll find 3 mines. And that should have been a big communication like red flag to everybody, that like, oh, this is the least linear process you could ever imagine. You throw money at exploration and you're not going to guarantee triple the success or double the success. It's not manufacturing. It's not even mining engineering, right? It's like, oh, well, we need to do twice as much stope optimizations. We'll hire another engineer, right? It's like, oh, we need to have twice as much discovery. Let's hire another geologist. It's like, no, that's not how it works ever. And I think it needs to be talked about and defined. And I always go back to like, I become very comfortable with sounding like an idiot over the years. I ask a lot of stupid questions because if I don't know, I'm like, what I found in my career is if I don't know and I want to ask this question, there's probably someone else in the room that don't and would also want to ask that question. But I'm okay with looking like an idiot so that they can learn, because it's like, and it's so, sometimes it's so embarrassing where people are just like, Scott, really? It's like, how did you get to your job? But and I almost go back to this talk as that, right? Where it's like, when I went into the talk, I actually did not expect that result of how many random retries I put into it, where it didn't discover the system. And that was actually really shocking, because I expected it to occasionally happen where it's like, oh, okay, if we had drilled this pattern, we would have found it. Oh, now we didn't. And instead it was like, oh my gosh, almost none of the patterns were successful at finding it, right? I mean, I forgot what I ran, like 25 different drill patterns or something like that. And I think like 3 of them were like, oh yeah, slam dunk, found the ore deposit, like off to the races. And I think that was actually way more frightening because maybe I'm a little bit too much of an optimist, because I thought actually that we'd have better success than we found. And then I went, oh wow, if that's my assumption, how many other people have that same assumption? How many corporate teams have that assumption where like, oh, they put 5 holes into a project, and it's like, let's walk away. And it's
completely, like that metric then gets pushed on to people, right? And then people go, well, like exactly what you're kind of talking about. It's like, if we create this graph of like discovery and spend, and people go, well, if X amount of dollars finds Y number of discoveries, then we're going to use that relationship and say, well, if I give Scott X dollars, he should find me Y discoveries. And then and then the question kind of becomes like, well, he should be able to find them with Z number of drill holes or something like that. And it's like, well, Scott, did you drill Z number of drill holes? Yeah, I drilled them. And so do we now have Y number of discoveries? You go, no. And they're like, but you had X number of dollars and you drilled Z number of holes. So how come you don't have Y number of discoveries? And you go, because like it's not like in equilibrium. It doesn't quite work in that sense. And I think this is like, so the corporate world kind of uses these simple metrics, but they're doing it in a way on a highly like complicated system, which is getting harder for us to kind of navigate at times, because like you said, we just don't know some things. And also I think the complexity of trying to find these things is obviously becoming more complex. So hence complexity is becoming more complex, but like it's a problem that's becoming more complex. So and we're not communicating that sometimes, so people are still using these old models, and we're getting hammered for it, I think, in some ways.
And it's kind of interesting because you look at, not to bash on Timmins or anything like that, but Timmins has been around for 100 years, huge gold camp, right? And I think it's 79 million ounces of production or something like that, and it's just a phenomenal gold camp, right? And so if you took and said, oh, there's X amount of drill holes in Timmins and X amount of mines, so therefore we need to drill X amount of holes to find a new mine, like you're never going to be successful, right? That is like ridiculous. It's like, and I go back to like fundamental communication thing that we need to put across, just to say, like even, we've got like world-class geophysics there. We've got great mapping. We've got all these like great data sets. And you can have a conversation with 4 exploration geologists, be like, where do you think this structure's going? And you get 4 different answers. And it's like, that's as good as it gets for definition, unless you did, like there's obviously like levels you can go to, and then you could do like like ridiculous levels of drilling to follow some of these things out. So when you start projecting things like a kilometer or 5 kilometers away and going, oh yeah, like I project these things will cross here or whatever, like that is not how it works, right? It's always, well, we thought the structure was running like this, and then it was offset by another post mineral shear zone, and then it was up here. Or, oh, we actually thought it would be offset, but it turns out that we had to throw on that fault wrong, right? And so there's all these things where it's like, even the basics of like how to target drill holes is nonlinear, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, target the structures. I think everybody would say, oh yeah, target the structures. And I remember early on in my career, and I might have told this example as well. So I was leading this one team, and I've been working there for a while, and I thought like I had a pretty good understanding of the geology, and we're talking about, like, oh, okay, so like my equivalent comes out to visit. Did I tell this story? If I did, interrupt me, but just edit it all out. But anyways, he's like, oh yeah, so what's your basic exploration criteria? And we're like, oh yeah, we're looking for dilatant fault jogs, and so like we see these orientations with the the motion during gold time, it should be dilatant, and so we should get some nice ore shoots, blah 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 blah. It's like, okay, great, that makes a lot of sense. And he's like, can anybody put like all the major mines on the board? And like someone goes up and draws all the major mines on this whiteboard. And I think like whiteboard's like one of the best things ever for helping geologists think, And he's like, okay, great. He's like, so let's put on here like how many of these were extensional jogs? Half of them. Half. So I had ignored half of our exploration search space because I'd gotten stuck in this idea, and it was obviously a successful one. Half the mines were this type, but then there's a whole bunch of compressional jogs that didn't even look at. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a major failing on my part that I was so like blinder that I only was looking at this one type of deposit. And it's like, and I ignored half of the ounces ever mined there. And it was like, okay, that's really embarrassing, right? But it stuck with me because this is the thing that I always tell people, like the main lesson I have to bring places is what not to do. And so we'll be talking about exploration projects, and that's one of the big questions I ask is, are we locked into the dogma? Are we locked into this is what we need to search for, when that's actually not the case? Maybe there's more. Maybe there's, like maybe this, like, oh yeah, only greenstones run gold. But what about this deposit and this deposit and this deposit were in sediments? Maybe sediments are a place we should explore as well. Maybe like one of the things I learned from a little company I worked at is it's phenomenal mapping from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and so you could actually like figure out the some of the geology in these areas that are obviously no longer accessible. And so it's like, okay, so why is there an ore deposit here? Why is this one ore shoot here? And it's like, so the gold fault, cleverly named, is running along like this, and we're all in shales, and all of a sudden there's a little fold in the shales, and instead of the gold fault being parallel to foliation or bedding, if you want, it's not bedding, but like, the schistosity, instead of it running parallel to schistosity and then having like planar slip along the schistosity, now it turns 15 degrees, or maybe it was even like 10 degrees. It was really, really, like, you wouldn't have like seen it on a map and gone like, oh yeah, check out that big change in geometry. It was super subtle. And all of a sudden you had an ore shoot. And then it went back to the orientation it was, and it was all planar slip again. And it's like, oh, so if we're drilling in sediment, is it parallel to shear sense, or is it off of that? Because it's like, I know I'm probably not going to explore it somewhere parallel to shear sense based on my experience to date, and maybe I'll be proven wrong that actually makes for great ore deposits if you have this criteria. Again, I'm really good at sounding like an idiot a lot of times, so I'm comfortable with that. But it's like, maybe if we're going to look in the sediments, we should focus on those areas. And so how do you figure that out? Mapping, right? And it's like, oh, well, you'd still do mapping I actually got this question not that long ago. You still do mapping at this level of exploration, like on surface? And it's like, 100%. That's the only way until you start drilling or doing trenches. It's the only way you know geometry. It's the only way like we were in one place, and it was like, I think one of the best pieces of career advice I ever received is don't start mapping until you've walked the whole outcrop. And so I've got this great structural geologist that works for me, and so we were out at the site, and like he's working with the teams on like structural geology and how to measure these different things. It was like phenomenal, right? Just like, like I always enjoy people like that because you just listen and just like he makes it simple and easy to learn. Anyway, so I like take the time to walk around the outcrop, right? And it's like, okay, so then we get back and it's like, all right, so what do you notice that's a big change? Like in this outcrop, there's a very big change and it's super subtle. And like, what do you see? And everybody's kind of looking around and they're like, oh, well, there's lots of folding over here. It's like, yeah. And it's just like, well, these beds are thinly bedded, like 1 millimeter beds. And these ones are 5 centimeter beds. So if you have the same structure go through these two units, they're going to react differently because of the bedding thickness.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that, if I kind of think about why we should ask these questions, one of the reasons is just to kind of show people that there is this diversity of kind of opinions that sit. So something that people would have thought would have been simple to identify or to explain is actually not very simple. And so how many other things in our industry do people actually think are quite simple but aren't? And maybe, like I'm not saying this to, to kind of make ourselves like feel a lot better or anything like that. But I just think there are certain practices that we do, which I think are, are our own fault. I mean, and we could do them a lot better. But there are certain things which are just, we are not trying to create this problem. It's just that this problem exists and we don't really have a great way out of it right now. But we should communicate that. And we shouldn't worry about sounding like idiots or sounding dumb when we can't answer these questions, because it is something that's kind of hard to kind of explain. I remember when we did this podcast episode around serendipity, And yeah, like, and I quite like this because, like, I was talking to this researcher who spent a whole time studying serendipity. She's done an honors, she's done a master's, she's done a PhD on it. She now like teaches, and I was like, and the first question I asked her was like, like, how do you define serendipity? And she's like, I don't have an answer. And like, like, right away, she's like, you've kind of broken me on the first question because I don't have an answer.
It's like, but
And
this is
she's
what
like,
you
yeah.
researched.
Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, it took you like 23 years to get to this answer. And she's like, yeah. And she said something which I quite liked. And she's like, well, it's actually taken me 23 years to become comfortable with that answer. And I went, that's actually a pretty good response. That you now acknowledge the limits of kind of like your own knowledge or your own understanding, and now you're comfortable telling people that limit. And I think maybe that's how we have to be in some ways around like certain things around discovery and exploration as well. We probably have to be comfortable with what we don't know or what we can't explain or what we can't easily do in a lot of ways as well. And maybe that's the like that's our cross to kind of bear. Maybe we should become comfortable with telling people like decision makers and saying that, hey, you're talking about like your perception of discovery is this simplified model, but our perception of discovery is to some degree walking around in a dark room with no flashlight at times. So and that's what we have to be comfortable with. And
that's a hard thing to say, especially if you're talking to it, right? But the alternative is if you tell them what they want to hear, which is that we have this under control and we know exactly what we're doing and we can promise you X amount of discoveries over the next X years, that's a lie, right? And it's like, and I hate to say that because it's like we have indication, but I think we really need to be comfortable with telling. Also, we have to tell not just the high ups, but we also have to tell the junior geos that too, because I've run into a lot of junior geos when I've said stuff like that. They've been like, oh, I thought that was just me. And I was like, really like, oh, I'm a terrible geologist and this. It's like, no, that is this. That's why it's not just a science, right? It's a science and an art. And it's really hard because you get a lot of people that assume that they have to know those things and that they're just bad at their jobs if they don't. And it's like, there's so much that we can't know, right? Like I read a quote. It was kind of funny. My wife and I went up to Breckenridge, Colorado the other day. And so it's a former mining town that's now a big ski town, all the former mining towns in Colorado, right? And there's this book of quotations on the wall. And actually I got a photo of it so it's like, it was like written in the 20s. And so it's really, really old. And let me see if I can find this quote. Yeah, here it is. So it was like quotations. So you just like turn the page to a section. And I was like, what if they have any quotations on geology? And it's just like, there's no way they're going to have a quotation on geology. And that too, but I'll read one of them. Geology gives us a key to the patience of God. And it's like, you think about that, this stuff is so complex and so long informing. It's impossible to know in a tiny short lifetime like ours, right? Where you could literally dedicate yourself a lifetime to understanding an outcrop if you went into sufficient detail to fully characterize it in every way possible on one out, right? And so it's like, how do we do that on a large scale? How do we do that and how do we pretend that we actually, right? Because what I've gotten, I guess, more comfortable with is that I'll never know some of these things, right? Like I can't see back in time. I can't do the whole time traveler thing and watch erosion happen in front of my eyes, right? And so I can't know. And I need to be okay with that. I need to be comfortable with that. And I need to also communicate that to the higher ups and to the people that report up through to me and my colleague and be like, that's okay. But what we can do is we can come up with a plan on how to learn more, right? So we can say, okay, I don't know this, but I can collect rock chip samples. I could do isotope analysis. I could do thin sections. God help us if we return to thin sections, right? And it's like, and we might not be able to know everything, but it goes back to like what's most important for us to know. And I think that's actually the most important part of my job is when I go to sites, like just like that example on the outcrop with a structural geologist, right? Is like, I don't have to know more than people. I don't have to know more about structural geology. I don't have to know more about geochemistry. I have to know who does know so I can bring them in. But ultimately, I have to try what my main job is I have to try and understand what matters most here. And that's really difficult. And it's also what I love about my job, because I have to translate all these other disciplines where people spend a lifetime and a PhD or two learning them. And I have to translate it into what matters here the most. And then I have to communicate that. And I have to work with other people on how they can communicate. And it's really fun, but it's also really amorphous, right? It's like, because like I'll show up and be like, oh yeah, I've seen a lot of rocks by now, right? I've seen a lot of different deposits. I've seen a lot of different deposit styles. And it's actually like, it was really fun. Like we were in one of our projects recently where we looked at a very large part of the project, and I was like, it's interesting. You guys have never seen this kind of deformation, and they're like, oh yeah, it's just not here. And then we happened to go to this one new area that nobody had ever been and saw this other style of deformation. It was like, it does exist, and it's like, and they're like, well, like, and we're talking about it, and so it's like, well, I don't know if it's going to exist, but I've seen other systems that have similar things. And so I was look for those things, and I go, okay, do we see stretching lineations? Do we see refolding folds? Do we what like? And it's and I think that's
I think one of the things that you're saying, which I quite like, is that like it's really around. Like I often describe it as like a sports team. Like like take any kind of sport. You can easily identify the teams that are going to be good versus the teams that are going to be bad. And there are some like definable characteristics about good teams. Like they tend to be well coached. They usually have a game plan that you can understood and see that the game plan repeats and they can execute that game plan. That's also a fundamental part of it. And they have like a roster of players that can always fill holes. Like it's not dependent on one person that gets injured and then the whole team and the game plan kind of goes by the wayside. And so, but that's not always necessarily the team that always wins. Like there's injuries and there's all these other things that kind of come into play. And, like maybe they play against, like a team where their game plan doesn't match up very well and then they lose and all of that stuff. But I always think that it's always easy to identify teams that play well and then the teams that play badly. And I think that's kind of how I think a little bit about exploration, that like what we want to do is we want to do more good things than bad things. So like we want to have more good on our side of the fence, and hopefully that will like get to a point where we'll get good results, and and we can kind of build on it and go from that point of view. But if we're just doing terrible things and we're not very well aligned and we're not all of these things, then all you're really hoping for is luck. Like that's it. That's your only out of the whole process. So maybe what we should work on is just trying to get good practices and then seeing how they can compound into something good along the way as well.
I think that's exactly it. Is if you're reliant on luck, even though I talked about that being an aspect of it, if you're reliant on it, it's like the people who play the lottery because they don't have a retirement plan. So they're like counting on the lot. And I read that was something like 35% of Americans or something like that, like count on the winning the lottery to be their retirement. And like, and the lottery is just a tax on people who can't do math, right? So but I go back to like what we need to do is we need to capitalize so that if we do have luck, that we're in a position to take it, right? And so we need to improve our skills. We need to improve our people. We need to improve like our morale, right? So like having a happy team that gets along well and shares information well is far more likely to be able to capitalize on that lucky moment when it does arrive, right? And we really need to take ego out of it too. Like I see so many people where they assume that they're the smartest person in the room and that only they can do this. And I just go, that's not what we're doing here. Like I look at with my role, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room. I have to know who are all the smart people so I can try and corral them and drive them towards a goal or whatever. But ultimately, the teams that I love working with, they're the teams that they banter with each other. They give each other hell over little things, and and they get along, and they can share information because they're comfortable that the other person's not going to steal it for their own personal benefit, right? That they're like, oh, if I tell this person that I saw this, they'll reciprocate and will collaborate. And it's like, and not like everybody's always talking about collaboration these days, but it's like, but like true collaboration is where people want to share. They want to get better. They want to see
Yeah,
their
it's not
teammates get
like
better.
it's not mandated or something like that. Yeah, it just happens naturally because yeah, like you have a vested interest in making other person's ideas or output better, and they have the same vested interest in your ideas and output. Yeah, that is the true kind of way that it should work.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to like that. I think it was Roy Woodall that was talking about the importance of hiring, right? And I keep quoting him, so he's going to be like my the third most common word I say is Roy, and the fourth is Woodall. But so,
Yeah,
anyways,
at the end of you're not the only one, so it's okay.
yeah, but he talks about like one of the most important things is hire, right? And I've seen this before where you can hire brilliant people, extremely well qualified, that destroy teams, and they make a well-functioning team implode and everybody turn against everybody else. And I've seen other teams where they're like maybe not the best expirationists, but because they work so well as a team, they have the best expiration success, right? And so it's like if you're not paying attention to every single person you're hiring, you're throwing that opportunity out the window, right? Where you could in any moment destroy your team because you didn't care to be involved in the hiring process, right? And it's like whether it's a junior geo or a senior geo or an expiration manager, that's all critical. And it's like it's one of the things I really like with my company and the management team I work with is they talk about those things. So like, like our group executive in charge of like the America's expiration, we talk about individuals on teams and who would fit well in what team. And like, we're always like, he's tasked me with trying to identify people that would be good to rotate into other regions if they're interested. And so it's like, it's not just like mentorship, it's development too, right? And that's slow and it takes time, but like he'll like we'll have conversations about geos that I interacted with on the outcrop and be like, oh yeah, they're just a contract core logger, but they're really good and like they're super passionate and they really get it. We need to find a way to bring this person on full time. And I'm talking about this with our group executive, right? It's like, so and I think that's key is just having that trust up and down through the organization that you'll bring on the right people and that you'll try to drive forward. And yeah, you can't kill your teams because someone looks good on paper. You could blow up a great
That's
team
right.
by doing that.
Yeah. So I'm getting the wrap up from Sean. So we got 10 minutes left. You got out of answering these questions last time. So the two questions we ask each guest at the end. So Scott, what is an idea that you think needs to die in our industry? It can be an idea, concept, of behavior, something that we need to jettison out of our industry.
So we talked about this a little bit, and I probably could have come up with a better one, and I tried, and I even wrote these down last time, and I've thought about them for the last like while, and I haven't come up with anything better. So my ideas to die is this idea of drilling by numbers, like i.e. expiration is actually non-linear, and like things like target rate and ranking is a tool, but it shouldn't become the entire process because it's not linear. It's not you do this, you drill X amount of holes, you find X amount of mines. So that idea, and I've seen it happen over and over again, where it's like rate and rank exercises can become tyrannical, and then you have to drill the highest target. And it's like, well, no, this is an exercise to get you to think about things. It's not something that you should be beholden to drill 1, 2, 3, 4. And because unfortunately, like exploration's not linear, right? Like sometimes it's only the artistic recognition, like that this is going on. Or going back to the fish analogy of going, if I cast just like this, it'll get like delivered right to the right part of this stream, but there has to be a fish there, right? So, and ideas that live or must live. Mentorship. So I talk about this like where I provide mentorship. I don't even think that's the kind of mentorship that I think we really need. What we need is a senior geo in the field with junior geos doing hands-on work and explaining it as they do it, right? And so years ago, I had the privilege to talk to, I think his name was Bob Horton, and he was the head of the U.S. Bureau of Mines under Ronald Reagan. And so he's like, we have this thing in Nevada, is the Geological Society in Nevada. So great organization for young geos listening. Join that because like I just learned so much. So I happened to sit next to this guy at dinner, and we were just talking. And oh my gosh, this guy is like the former head of the Bureau of Mines and Geology, which is now like USGS, right? And And we're talking, he's like, when I was a young student, he's like, this guy, Vincent Gianelli, hired me in Virginia City as a field hand. And so I was working in Virginia City at this time. And so I knew who Vincent Gianelli was because I looked at all his maps, and he did phenomenal mapping. And so he described this process of like, he's a junior geo and he went everywhere that Vincent Gianelli did in this mapping project. He went to all the underground mines. He sampled all the stuff with him. He did all the hard jobs. He did all the good jobs. But he learned from this guy who I view now as like a master of the subject of mapping, right? And of course, like everybody can improve, right? But he spent time with him. And so I look at that like it's like one of the things that I really like is like I've got my structural geologist employee, and so his name's Will. And so Will comes along and we go on projects together. And I don't think I've told him that I'm meeting him, but it's like a lot of it is just we do the job and we talk about the job. We don't just say, oh, you're going to log core for 6 years and not do anything else.
Or you're going to have like 3 mentoring hours with me every whatever year or stuff like that. It's not like, again, it's not a metric that can be put into people's thing. It has to be a part of your job as you do it.
Yeah. And so shout out to Dick Reed, was the former chief geologist North America a few years back. Talking to a couple of junior geos, and I wanted them to go and map on this one project, but they didn't have like the skills and experience. So our chief geologist from North America went and mapped on this project with these 2 young geos for a week, and just here's how I map and here's how I do this. And it's all reconnaissance scale. So it's very different from what they were experiencing, which was like mine scale detailed mapping. And so it's like, here's how you do reconnaissance scale mapping. And I think there's so much value to just going along with someone, especially someone like Dick Reed, like just like wealth of knowledge and information. And so it's like, and I look at like, that's something that I now am trying to model as well. Is like, this guy showed me how that should be done. And so I'm like, I should be doing the same thing. So when I go in the field, it shouldn't just be a field visit for me to gather information. I need to share my thoughts and my workflow and what I'm looking at and the things I'm confused by and the things like how do I going to get past those confusions. And but it's not like traditional mentorship. It's almost like apprenticeship. And so that's what I want to see live in this industry.
I think those are both excellent ones. I love the apprenticeship. I think in some ways, mentorship is like an easy way out of apprenticeship, right? And we run to that because it's easy and it can be done in an HR way and all that stuff. But really what we're looking for is apprenticeship, because that's where the transfer of tacit knowledge actually goes through. And I think that's something that, we are kind of missing in this industry to a large degree.
Yeah. And it's only made worse by the lost generation, right? Like the missing generation of the geos 40 to 60. How many of them do you know worldwide? I think I counted 23 that I know worldwide between 40 and 60. And it's like, and you're looking at like people like me. I had a couple early experiences where I had a couple great mentors early in my geology career, and it made all the difference in the world, right? And it was more of an apprenticeship than anything else. It's like I worked for them, but they shared that with me. And it's like, and so what happens when all those folks retire? If we haven't passed on that tacit knowledge, it's gone.
I know we're pretty close to that line as well. So yes, I think it's something that like we're only going to know in about 10 years what the cost of that really is. So anyway, Scott, this was great. We could keep going. I think we could do a third episode as well. But
part 3 of Infinity.
All I can say is thanks a lot for coming on the show again. This was great.
I was to say, hopefully it adds something to someone, because I know one of the things I've really enjoyed about the show is learning new ideas, new ways of thinking, and hearing like what's gone right and what's gone wrong. And so I hope that whatever I've talked about has been beneficial to someone, how the show has been beneficial to me personally. So it's thanks for the invite to be on it.
You have a standing invite to come back anytime. So we'll leave it there. So anytime you want to come on and ask any other simple yet seemingly dumb questions, and we wanted to have a discussion about, we're happy to have you on.
All right. No, that sounds like a plan.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott.
All right. Talk to you guys later.
Magnetic survey coverage continues to expand rapidly worldwide, but the ability to assimilate this data into exploration programs has not kept pace. Southern Geoscience, a global leader in integrating geophysical knowledge, will be offering their Integration of Aeromagnetic and Geology course ahead of the 2023 PDAC conference. This introductory and hands-on course aims to enlighten participants on the strengths and weaknesses of potential field methods and to illustrate how they can best be used to advance exploration programs. The course will run in person in Toronto on the 2nd and 3rd of March 2023. For more information or to register, go to sgc.com.au. That's sgc.com.au, or follow them on LinkedIn. Early bird rates apply until the end of January. Until next time, let's keep exploring. Thanks to Scott for coming on our show, and Sean for putting it together, and to you all for listening. I'm your host Ahmad, and this is Exploration Radio. Exploration Radio is brought to you by the Australian Institute of Geoscientists, 121 Group, and The Assay. Exploration Radio is also an official media partner of the 2023 PDAC conference. Until next time, let's keep exploring.